Tonight on the show, first up, I'm very excited, Kevin Avery, an author who's actually from right here in Salt Lake City, but now makes his home in Nueva York. He has written a couple of really fantastic and brilliant books. One about the critic Paul Nelson, one of the guys who actually basically invented rock criticism at Rolling Stone magazine, and also Paul Nelson's conversations with Clint Eastwood. All right, moving on. This is what I've been waiting for. I've been waiting for this interview for like 2 weeks, maybe longer. We are pleased tonight to have in the studio an author of 2 recently published books, both about the fantastic and legendary rock critic writer Paul Nelson. Please welcome Kevin Avery. Kevin, great to see you.
Nice to see you.
Congratulations on these books. I just
Thank
have
you.
to say they really are accomplishments in the truest sense of the word. Where should we start? Should we start with the biography?
I think that's a good place to start.
All right. So tell folks about Paul Nelson.
Well, Paul Nelson is really one of the guys who created rock criticism. And Paul started out writing about folk music. And Paul was a friend of Bob Dylan's. And Paul was there when Dylan went electric in 1965. And Paul always liked to say, when Dylan went electric, so did he. And
he was bullish on it, unlike
oh no, absolutely.
the rest of everybody.
Yeah, I mean, he was really probably the major critic who did champion Dylan going electric. A lot of the traditional folksters, you know, certainly they just did not want any part of that. They thought that it was a violation of everything that Dylan had accomplished. And Paul, however, saw that Dylan was taking the next step in his artistry. And Paul at that time then started writing about rock and roll, and he was one of the very first critics to do that, and with a small handful of other writers, really pioneered what we know of today as rock journalism.
And it's crazy for me to think that this is kind of like this is the headwaters, as it were, of what is even beyond kind of the written word of rock criticism or music criticism. But on some level, there's kind of a paradigm that exists that people do rock criticism about a new record to one another over cocktails at a party or anything like that, and to think that in Rolling Stone, this was the guy who really took the time to dissect, for lack of a better way to put it.
He did, and many of his pieces would be several thousand words long, because it really was an act of discovery. The old thing about writing is discovery. They were writing about music that had never been done before. So for Paul, it really was an act of discovery, and he did that not only in the early days of rock and roll, the 60s and the 70s. In the late 70s, he did it all over again when punk rock came along. And he was one of the first major critics to, really embrace the Sex Pistols and the Ramones and point listeners in the direction of these new artists.
And again, it's interesting, almost difficult to imagine that there was a time when a guy like this would have to champion the Sex Pistols or the Ramones, what are such cornerstones of pop rock music nowadays.
Well, and it was even then. I mean, certainly in the late '60s and the early '70s, but rock criticism was not the same as it was today. I mean, everybody really looked at these guys. Record companies, especially, would look to these guys and want to be able to find out, maybe these guys can lead us to what the next big thing is. And so, Paul in the early '70s was hired by Mercury Records as an A&R guy.
I was going to say, he ended up an A&R guy, at least for a little while, didn't he?
5 years.
Huh.
He always liked to say it was 5 of the best years and 5 of the worst years of his life, because most of the time there he spent trying to sign the New York Dolls. And he's the guy who was responsible for signing the Dolls to their first recording contract. And he put his job on the line at Mercury Records, and it didn't work out for either Paul or the New York Dolls at Mercury. So
even though, again, talk about cultural DNA of so much of, Motley Crue are legends, and they just bit the style of the New York Dolls almost 100%.
Right, but it is interesting to note, even though it didn't work out at that time, here we are, 2012, and the New York Dolls, the 2 remaining living members are still going. And that's one thing that you find with a lot of the artists that Paul championed. They're still making music today.
He definitely had a good touch to pick the things that were not just good of the moment, but like you say, really have resonated and have lasted.
Absolutely.
So, talk a little bit about his life and kind of the journey that he took, because maybe it's simple to say it was a life in two parts, but
yeah, he loved music. He became famous as a rock critic. His first love, however, was always film, and so it's not uncommon to find cinematic references in many of his reviews. But he became famous for these very long, sprawling pieces. A lot of people remember Paul for his Rolling Stone cover story on Warren Zevon's battle with alcoholism. And for Paul, it was very important to understand the music as much as possible. As a result, he befriended many of these artists. And so, he was friends with guys like Springsteen and Jackson Browne and Bruce Springsteen and Rod Stewart, because he wanted to know more about their music. He wanted to know about the process and how they came about that music. But as the years went on and music changed, as it did significantly in the early 80s, when music became more about haircuts in some cases, Paul lost interest in the music and walked away from not only the music, but from his job as editor at Rolling Stone.
Which is a heavy thing to consider, but
yes.
But he was never the kind of guy to, as I understand it anyway, to be false in any way. So,
there was not a phony bone in his body, I don't think.
Hews closely to what you would expect from his personage. Let's take a quick break.
Okay.
We're going to be back with more with Kevin Avery, Paul Nelson, right here on Mountain Views. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We're still here on Mountain Views. We're still talking literature, rock criticism, and writing. The first book is Everything is an Afterthought, The Life and Writings of Paul Nelson. We're here with the author, Kevin Avery, to talk about book number 2. We're moving along. And this is Conversations with CLINT. So you were saying, before we went on the break, that Paul was always a big film guy, so he had this incredible career in music journalism.
Right.
But the second book takes on a different tack, a filmic tack, as it were.
Yeah, Paul always really wanted to be a film critic, but when he came to New York, he said it was easier to become a music critic, so that's what he did. But he loved movies, and actually during the early 70s, while he was working at Mercury and A&R, he wrote several very stunning film reviews for Rolling Stone, and one of them was a review of Dirty Harry. Paul was one of the few mainstream critics who really praised the film. Yeah, and in that review, he actually predicted that in the coming decades, we were going to see some remarkable things from Clint Eastwood as an actor and a director. Fast forward a few years to 1979, Paul convinces his editors at Rolling Stone that a cover story with Eastwood is would be a good thing to do, because at this time Eastwood was moving away from the actor. He was becoming a director. So in 1979, Paul flies to Boise, Idaho, where Clint is making Bronco Billy, interviews him, and unfortunately, Paul, who sometimes had a problem with deadlines, he was unable to finish that particular piece. Long story short, over the next 4 years, Paul goes back and re-interviews Eastwood and amasses over 17 hours worth of tapes, which Paul was never able to write the articles. So after Paul passed away in 2006, his son and I found the tapes in Paul's apartment. And so Conversations with Clint is the result of that. It's those interviews edited together as kind of a 4-year ongoing conversation between friends, which is really what Paul and Clint became. The first thing that struck me when I listened to these tapes is not only how interesting they were, but it was clear that these guys really liked each other. They just enjoyed sitting around talking. And it was very clear that Clint enjoyed Paul's company.
And I think it's a really great story. Anytime there's an example such as this where the guy who was to later become an incredibly huge, successful guy, big movie star,
Right.
one of the biggest movie stars of his day, had the blessing of probably reading that Dirty Harry review in Rolling Stone and going, wow, this Paul Nelson guy, he gets me, right? And there's always, it seems to always be a loyalty there after that between people like that that you think, oh, well, Paul Nelson, I don't really know that guy, but and Clint Eastwood, mega billion star, whatever, and yet a real bond of I'm sure gratitude from somebody as erudite and intelligent as Clint Eastwood.
Yeah.
So now we have to back up because I have the time and I want you to tell folks a little bit of your backstory as a writer in general and your relationship, as it were, with Paul Nelson over the years and your sort of prescience in recognizing him when you were a very young person.
Yeah, when I was a teenager, I read Paul's work in Rolling Stone and Village Voice, and I just always loved the language of his writing. I would enjoy going back and rereading them. I even saved clippings of the stuff that Paul wrote. And when Paul disappeared in the early 80s, I always thought somebody should really collect this guy's writing. And what ended up happening in 2005 when I moved away from Salt Lake to Brooklyn, I reached out to Paul. I found out that he was working at a video store as a clerk. And I suggested that we get together and anthologize some of his best work. And because Paul had always been an influence on me as a writer. Living in Salt Lake, I'd written for Salt Lake Magazine, Utah Holiday, Catalyst, The Event. And I never did hear back from Paul when I made that suggestion. In July of 2006, I heard from one of Paul's best friends who called to tell me that Paul had passed away. But he wanted me to know that Paul had indeed received that letter, was very touched by it, and indeed wanted to work together when he got feeling better. But unfortunately, he just mentally and physically never really did get feeling better.
Well, you were certainly meant to write these books.
Oh, thank you.
And again, congratulations. They're beautiful. And I've only read excerpts so far, but they are definitely going to be night table companions for me. And I guess the last thing we have to do is give you a chance to tell folks where you're going to be signing books this weekend.
Yes. Tomorrow, Friday, I'll be at the King's English in Salt Lake at 15th and 15th at 7 o'clock. And on Saturday, I'll be at Dolly's Bookstore here in Park City at 6:30.
Excellent. Well, glad you could make it. Nice thing of being a Salt Lake native that you're here, and we were able to get you to come in and chat. We appreciate it. Best wishes
Thank you,
for
too.
continued success, and hope to see you again with the next tome soon.
Okay, thank you.
All right, quick break, and we'll be right back. I think we got some more tickets, so don't go away.